Old sneakers, threadbare jacket, and a trembling walk. Those were the first impressions the airline staff at Heathrow Airport formed when they spotted Mr. Charles Mason shuffling into the departure hall. Whispers spread among them like wildfire. Some snickered openly at his outdated, mismatched clothing. Others dismissed him as a vagrant who'd stumbled into the wrong terminal. No one bothered to ask him if he needed help or even greet him politely. They saw only an elderly black man who looked out of place. Little did they know, behind that unassuming facade lay a history of monumental success and unimaginable wealth. Charles Mason, 76 years old, exuded the kind of quiet dignity that often comes from a life marked by perseverance. His hair, silvery in patches, was neatly combed, but his clothes told a different story. The elbows of his worn-out blazer were frayed, and the soles of his battered sneakers were peeling. Strapped across his shoulder was an old leather satchel that had once been a stylish accessory, now scuffed and faded with age. He had arrived at Heathrow Airport on a drizzly London morning, prepared for a flight to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. Despite the hustle and bustle of the terminal, Charles carried himself with a calm resilience, carefully checking his passport and ticket before proceeding to the check-in desk. In his hands was a small plastic bag of homemade sandwiches, a testament to a humble, frugal lifestyle. From the moment he stepped into the terminal airline, staffers behind the counters exchanged glances. One of them, a ticket agent named Tanya, arched an eyebrow at his appearance. Another staffer, Lucas, elbowed her with a smirk. They whispered and giggled under their breath, making assumptions about this quiet old man who didn't seem to fit their image of a respectable passenger. To them, he was simply out of place, a relic from another era, possibly too poor to afford a proper outfit for flying. Charles approached the check-in line. He waited patiently as a few younger passengers cut in front of him, in a rush, bumping his old satchel. He did not complain. Even when the corners of his bag snagged on the metal railing, forcing him to pause and disentangle it, he accepted it with a quiet sigh. That moment gave the mocking staff an opportunity to exchange more snickers. Eventually, it was Charles's turn. Tanya looked him up and down before offering a perfunctory greeting. "You have your ID and ticket?" she asked, glancing at the plastic bag in his hand. "Yes, ma'am," Charles said softly. He carefully handed over his passport, which was well worn, like the rest of his belongings. He wasn't oblivious to the suspicion in Tanya's eyes, nor to the stares from Lucas behind her, but he chose to remain polite. Tanya examined the passport, her expression turning from mild amusement to condescending disapproval. "You traveling alone?" she asked, her tone hinting at her disbelief. She might have assumed he couldn't possibly afford the ticket. Charles nodded. "Indeed I am," he replied. "Just me this time." Tanya glanced at Lucas, who suppressed a sarcastic grin. Then she returned the passport and boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight," she said without warmth. Charles offered a gentle, gracious smile and moved on, pulling his satchel gently behind him. The staffers watched him go, shaking their heads as though they couldn't fathom how someone like him had a legitimate reason to fly. Little did they know that beneath that modest exterior lay a titan of industry, a retired billionaire whose wealth dwarfed their imagination. This unassuming passenger was about to upend every one of their preconceived notions. Tanya and Lucas had been working at the airline's check-in counter for nearly a year. They were used to dealing with travelers from every walk of life: business elites in expensive suits, families loaded with luggage, trendy backpackers moving through Europe, and sometimes the occasional disorganized passenger who forgot crucial documents at home. Their day-to-day interactions usually passed without much drama. However, every so often they found a target for their behind-the-desk whispers, an individual they deemed strange, unprepared, or simply not dressed accordingly. That morning, Charles Mason became their target. After Charles shuffled away, Tanya leaned closer to Lucas, speaking just low enough so the other passengers in line wouldn't catch her words. "Did you see those shoes?" she said. "He looked like he dug them out of a donation bin." Lucas snickered. "No kidding. Old man must be lost or something. Bet he has no idea how to navigate an international flight." Tanya clicked her nails against the keyboard while pulling up the next passenger's details. "It just boggles my mind that people show up like that. I mean, at least try to look presentable." Their conversation was cut short when the next person in line stepped up. Their mocking commentary melted into plastic professionalism as they checked tickets and passports. But even as they attended to other travelers, their thoughts kept returning to Charles. They formed an unspoken agreement to keep an eye on him. Something about his quiet demeanor and shabby attire made them feel superior, and they enjoyed that. Across the terminal, Charles made his way through the labyrinth of security checkpoints. He dutifully removed his belt, shoes, and watch, placing them in a bin. The security officer eyed the battered sneakers with a raised eyebrow but said nothing. Another officer smiled kindly at him, noticing how carefully he handled his items as though they had sentimental value. When Charles finished at security, he gathered his things and sat at a nearby bench to retie his sneakers. As he did, he overheard two young men gossiping about some celebrity sighting in the airport lounge. He paid them no mind, focusing on the simple tasks at hand, checking that his passport and boarding pass were still in his breast pocket, counting out his medication pills to ensure he had them for the flight, and nibbling on half a sandwich to calm his nerves. Meanwhile, Tanya and Lucas took their break together, heading to a small cafe in the staff area. Between sips of coffee, they recounted the funniest or strangest passenger encounters of the morning, most of which centered on insulting Charles's appearance. "What if he tries to fly first class?" Tanya joked. Lucas laughed. "Yeah, I'd pay to see him turned away at the cabin door." In the background, an announcement for the next flight to New York crackled over the PA system. Neither of them imagined that Charles could be on that flight. And if he was, they assumed he must be in the cheapest seat available, possibly squeezed in a corner next to the lavatory. But Charles, if he chose, could have bought out the entire first-class cabin without making a dent in his fortune. For now, though, the airline staff only saw a threadbare jacket, cracked leather bag, and tired face, completely oblivious to the extraordinary life story hidden beneath. Charles found a quiet corner in the terminal, away from the crowds. He settled into a chair and let his eyes wander, but his mind drifted inward to the past. His worn-out clothes weren't random choices. Each piece held meaning. The faded blazer once belonged to his father, a hard-working man who rode trains to construction jobs across Georgia. It reminded Charles of the values he was raised with: honesty, humility, resilience. The old sneakers, a gift from his late wife, Gloria. She used to say, "Shoes don't need to shine to carry you far." Those sneakers had walked through boardrooms, factories, and rural villages during charity missions. Then there was the leather satchel, his first real business gift from a partner when they landed their first big deal. That bag saw the rise of an empire, yet Charles never replaced it. He valued meaning over material. Across the terminal, he noticed Lucas laughing with co-workers. Though too far to hear, Charles recognized the look: judgment disguised as amusement. He sighed but didn't retaliate. He'd lived long enough to know that the world often judged too quickly and too harshly. He zipped up the blazer, checked his watch, and stood. It was nearly time to board Flight 177 to to New York. Despite the stares and whispers, Charles carried himself with quiet dignity. His clothes told a story. No label ever could. A story of love, struggle, and legacy. As the boarding announcement for British Airways Flight 177 crackled over the intercom, passengers began clustering around the gates. Tanya and Lucas, now stationed at gate B32, were scanning boarding passes with mechanical efficiency. They watched as a parade of business travelers, families, and tourists in designer hoodies approached. Whenever a passenger presented a first or business class ticket, the flight attendants smiled extra wide, greeting them with a cheerful, "Welcome aboard." That's how they'd been trained. Prioritize those likely paying top dollar. Suddenly, Charles appeared at the perimeter of the crowd. Despite the jostling of impatient travelers, he remained calm. He held his boarding pass between two fingers, waiting for the line to thin. Tanya, engaged in scanning the pass of a chic businesswoman in a tailored suit, spotted Charles in the corner of her eye. She cast a quick glance at Lucas, who stood behind her with a handheld device, occasionally stepping in to help. "You again," Tanya murmured under her breath. She then called out, "Sir, if you're boarding with economy class, the line for general boarding is over there," pointing to a longer queue snaking back into the terminal. Charles opened his mouth to clarify, but he paused, noticing the line of anxious passengers behind him. He decided to comply, first stepping into the economy queue. As he waited, he triple-checked his boarding pass. His seat assignment read 4B. That was definitely in the business class section. When his turn came to scan his pass, he handed it to Lucas. Lucas glanced at the seat number and frowned. "Sir, this is business class. Are you sure you got the right pass?" His voice was laced with condescension. Charles gave a polite nod. "Yes, that's correct." Lucas exchanged a skeptical look with Tanya, who leaned over to take a look herself. She snorted softly. "Well," she said, "let's see if this scans as valid." She ran the barcode under the scanner, and to her visible surprise it beeped green without any issues. She pursed her lips. "It's valid," she admitted. A moment of awkward silence followed as Tanya printed out the slip that would direct Charles to the business class cabin. Lucas slowly tore it off, handing it to him with a forced grin. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Mason," Lucas said, though his tone suggested anything but sincerity. Charles took the slip, his face neutral. "Thank you," he replied, and walked down the jet bridge. From behind, he could hear Tanya let out a derisive huff. "Must have been an upgrade glitch," she muttered under her breath. "There's no way he actually paid for a business class ticket." Lucas shrugged. "Maybe he's spending his retirement savings on a bucket list flight. Who knows?" Their curiosity piqued, but protocol demanded they keep the line moving. Meanwhile, Charles made his way to the wide seats near the front of the plane. A flight attendant greeted him at the door, guiding him to row 4. Charles could sense the sideways glances from other business class passengers. Some stared at his well-worn blazer and old sneakers with bemused curiosity. Others turned their noses up altogether. Still, Charles eased into his seat, set his satchel down, and reflected on the irony. If he'd wanted, he could have bought a private jet or purchased an entire row of seats for himself. But for today, humility and comfort were more than enough. The moment Charles settled into his business class seat, he could almost taste the tension in the cabin. Several other passengers, mostly corporate types with suits and crisp shirts, cast fleeting glances in his direction. The overhead storage compartment was nearly full, so Charles tucked his satchel under the seat in front of him, taking care not to inconvenience the passenger beside him. In the seat across the aisle, a middle-aged woman, sporting a diamond-studded watch, eyed Charles warily. She leaned toward her companion, a man in an expensive blazer, and whispered, "Do you think he's in the right seat?" He doesn't look like the kind of person who—" Her companion cut her off. "Shh, you'll offend someone," he chided, though he shared her sentiments. A flight attendant named Miriam approached Charles with a warm smile, offering a hot towel. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Mason. May I help you with anything before we take off?" Charles returned the smile. "I'm fine, thank you," he said, accepting the towel. He appreciated the courtesy, a stark contrast to Tanya and Lucas's attitudes at the gate. Miriam glanced at his old blazer, but maintained her welcoming manner. It was clear she believed in treating all business-class passengers equally, no matter how they dressed. A few rows behind him, two other flight attendants began discussing Charles in hushed tones. One discreetly pointed out his attire, wondering if it might become an issue with the airline's VIP travelers. The other shrugged, muttering something about the airline's commitment to diversity and how they couldn't possibly deny him the seat he'd paid for. Nevertheless, their body language showed curiosity, bordering on skepticism. As the plane began to taxi, Charles gazed out the window, letting the hum of the engines calm him. He recalled the days when he used to be a frequent flyer, striking deals across continents. He had sat in every class economy, premium, economy business, and first depending on whatever flight was available at the time. He'd even flown cargo once in a pinch. None of it mattered to him. The destination was always more important than the status. But here in the hush of the business class, cabin status was everything to the other passengers. They sized him up, perplexed that someone with his outward appearance could afford to be in their midst. Charles could hear bits of conversation from the seat behind him. "Must be a lottery winner or something," one voice speculated. "Who knows," said another. "He could be some eccentric artist. You know how they can be." Charles allowed their words to drift over him. He'd long grown used to people making assumptions, especially about his race and attire. Over the years, he learned that challenging every misconception would sap his energy. He preferred to stay centered, quietly, letting the facts speak for themselves when the time was right. From her station flight attendant, Miriam kept an eye on Charles, sensing something unusual about his composure. His calmness under the pointed stares and whispered judgments piqued her curiosity. Though she had no idea about his past or fortune, she felt there was a story behind those gentle eyes, one that might surprise everyone on board. Not long after takeoff, the plane settled into its cruising altitude. Seatbelt signs dimmed, and flight attendants bustled through the aisle, offering drinks and menus. Charles politely declined any alcohol, opting instead for a simple cup of tea. He placed the teacup gingerly on his tray table, careful not to spill any. A fleeting memory stirred within him the day he sealed his first big international deal in London many decades ago. He remembered celebrating with champagne, back then feeling on top of the world. But times changed. He changed. Now, a quiet cup of tea suited him best. While sipping, Charles caught snippets of a conversation from the row ahead. A tall, distinguished gentleman was discussing business metrics with a colleague. Terms like quarterly earnings, liquid assets, and profit margin floated through the air. These words were part of a language Charles had spoken fluently for decades, a language he had mastered so well that he'd become a legend in his field. But the man turned slightly and looked at Charles, only to quickly shift his gaze away, presumably dismissing him as someone who wouldn't understand. A subtle turbulence made the cabin lights flicker. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Charles closed his eyes, bracing himself as the plane jolted. Several passengers gasped, clutching armrests. The flight attendants calmly assured everyone it was a minor patch of rough air. Charles breathed through it, recalling many such flights in his life, some of them far more nerve-wracking. The turbulence spurred another reflection, how life was in many ways a series of unsettled skies. Charles thought about the challenges he faced as a young black entrepreneur in the 1970s, the discrimination, the doubters, who believed he'd never amount to anything. Every unexpected jolt had tested his resolve, but he always held steady, riding out the storm until clear skies prevailed. Now, a small grin crossed his face as the aircraft smoothed out again. He was proud of how far he'd come and how much he'd been able to give back. As the flight attendants resumed meal service, Charles asked Miriam for a vegetarian option, explaining that he preferred lighter fare during travel. She brought him a vegetable pasta dish, and he thanked her warmly. Miriam hesitated for a moment, as though tempted to strike up a conversation, but the quick pace of her job pulled her away. Meanwhile, Tanya and Lucas, still in their uniforms, were also on board, but stationed at the rear economy galley. They hadn't fully realized that Charles was seated in business class until they overheard a fellow flight attendant mention an elderly passenger in business who looks a bit out of place. Tanya's ears perked up at the description. Leaning over to Lucas, she whispered, "It has to be that old man we checked in." Lucas chuckled. "Must be a glitch. Or maybe the airline had pity on him and gave him an upgrade," he speculated. The conversation triggered a spark of mischief in Tanya's mind. "I want to see how he's getting along. Let's take a quick peek during the next break," she proposed. Lucas agreed. They were itching for more reasons to gossip. They had no clue that fate, or perhaps karma, had set in motion a chain of events that would soon escalate beyond their control. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin lighting had been dimmed to allow passengers some rest. A handful of travelers were dozing under blankets, while others watched movies. Charles, however, was wide awake, his thoughts drifting between the flight and the philanthropic foundation he'd established several years ago. He was returning to the United States to finalize new plans for a series of educational programs aimed at underprivileged youth. Unbeknownst to Charles, Tanya and Lucas had finagled a brief moment to step into the business class section. They pretended to assist with a passenger inquiry, but really just wanted to catch a glimpse of him. Spotting Charles, Tanya nudged Lucas and muttered under her breath, "There he is." Lucas responded with a suppressed snicker. "I wonder if he's wearing those same beat-up sneakers he said." They made their way up the aisle until they were just a row behind Charles, who was calmly reading a newspaper, the Financial Times no less. Tanya's eyes widened slightly. "He's reading the Financial Times," she whispered. "Where did he even get that?" Lucas shrugged, but a sudden wave of turbulence shook the plane again, forcing them to brace themselves against the seatbacks. The pilot's voice crackled over the PA, instructing everyone to return to their seats. Tanya and Lucas hurried back to the safety of the galley at the rear, their curiosity piqued more than ever. Charles, oblivious to their brief intrusion, folded his newspaper. He noticed a flight attendant making the rounds with water. Motioning politely, he asked, "Could I have a glass of water, please?" "Of course," the attendant replied, handing him a cup. He recognized her as one of the staff who'd briefly discussed him earlier. Yet her professionalism remained intact, and Charles appreciated that. He took a sip, letting the cool liquid settle his nerves. Returning to his thoughts, Charles recalled how he had once been approached by British Airways itself to invest in a new route expansion. While the deal fell through due to external factors, it struck him as ironic that some employees of the same airline were now quietly ridiculing him. The memory made him smile, not with bitterness, but with a sense of life's peculiar sense of humor. In the background, the hush of the dimmed cabin was punctuated by the hum of the engines. Occasionally, a burst of turbulence rattled trays and overhead compartments, but everyone seemed to relax into the knowledge that the aircraft was stable. Charles glanced around, noticing how different passengers responded to the flight. Some clutched their belongings anxiously, others leaned back with practiced ease. Each person carried their own story, their own reasons for traveling. Quietly, Charles closed his eyes and let the steady vibration of the flight cradle him in a half-doze. He was grateful in a way to be seen as inconspicuous. It gave him the freedom to observe human behavior unfiltered. Yet he had a feeling that the tension around his presence wasn't finished brewing. Perhaps soon, the curtain separating misconception from truth would be pulled aside, exposing everyone's biases and surprising them all. Barely an hour after Tanya and Lucas's recon trip to business class, an incident erupted in the economy cabin. A boisterous passenger, irritated by the limited legroom and an uncooperative seat recline, began shouting at one of the junior flight attendants. The commotion sent a ripple of unease throughout the plane. Several passengers craned their necks to see what was going on. Tanya and Lucas rushed to de-escalate the situation. They tried to pacify the disgruntled man whose face was flushed with anger. Sir Tanya pleaded, "We understand your frustration, but please keep your voice down. You're disturbing other passengers." The man was in no mood to listen. His voice rose another notch, and soon the lead flight attendant arrived, giving Tanya and Lucas a pointed look that said, "Handle this." Since they were among the more experienced crew on board, the expectation was that they could calm the storm. While the tension brewed in economy, Charles remained unaware of the specifics. He felt the general shift in mood, sensing the raised voices from behind the business class curtain. Gently, he peered back, but saw only the usual swirl of flight attendants moving in haste. He shrugged, returning to his seat. Tanya finally managed to persuade the troublesome passenger to lower his voice by offering a complimentary drink and an apology for the inconvenience. The crisis subsided, leaving her and Lucas exhausted. As they made their way back to the galley, Tanya sighed. "I swear, I can't wait until we land." Lucas rubbed his eyes. "Me neither. We've still got hours to go." Their conversation, however, soon drifted back to Charles. "You know," Lucas said quietly, "I saw him reading the Financial Times." "Could he actually be somebody important?" Tanya smirked. "You think he's a CEO on a disguise mission?" She rolled her eyes. "He's probably just reading random pages for show. Who knows?" Their cynicism overshadowed any open-mindedness. They decided it wasn't worth dwelling on. Soon they'd land, and Charles Mason would be out of their lives. They had no inkling that their flight's final act would reveal more than they were prepared to handle. Meanwhile, the seatbelt sign blinked on once again as the aircraft encountered another pocket of turbulence. Charles tightened his belt, his knuckles whitening as the plane jerked. He glanced around at the other business-class passengers, some wide-eyed, clutching their armrests. If he were younger, he might have joined them in anxious prayers. But age and experience had taught him patience. He breathed in, focusing on the moment, waiting for the turbulence to pass. Suddenly, the plane lurched harder than before, sending an overhead bag tumbling into the aisle. Gasps echoed. A flight attendant hurried to secure the loose luggage. Even Charles's stoic demeanor broke for a second, his heart pounding. For a moment, the entire cabin felt suspended in tension, as though everyone braced for the next jolt. Then, just as abruptly, the turbulence vanished. The plane smoothed out, and the captain's voice came over the speaker, reassuring passengers they had passed through the rough patch. A collective sigh of relief washed over the cabin. Little did they know that emotional turbulence still loomed on the horizon. For some, the biggest shake-up of the flight had nothing to do with the weather. It was about to come from revelations that would challenge everything they thought they knew. As the flight drifted closer to its halfway point, the business-class cabin stirred with renewed activity. Passengers stretched their legs, and a few began conversation with their seatmates. Charles found himself approached by the well-dressed gentleman who had been glancing at him intermittently throughout the flight. "Excuse me," the gentleman said, leaning from the aisle seat. "I couldn't help but notice you were reading the Financial Times. Are you by chance in the business sector?" Charles looked up, offering a courteous smile. "I used to be," he replied. "I'm retired now." The man introduced himself as Robert Langford, CFO of a mid-sized pharmaceutical company based in London. He was traveling to New York for a convention. Despite the difference in their appearances, Robert in his tailored suit, Charles in his threadbare blazer, they found a common language in finance and economics. They spoke quietly, mindful of other resting passengers. Charles answered Robert's questions about global markets with succinct but pointed observations. Robert seemed both startled and impressed by Charles's depth of knowledge. Eventually, Robert's curiosity got the better of him, and he asked, "If you don't mind me asking, what was your business before you retired?" Charles hesitated for a beat, then said, "I founded an investment firm that branched into real estate, tech, and logistics. I stepped down when I turned 70. He left out the specifics, like how he had once been listed in Forbes as one of the country's top billionaires. There was no need to mention that. Robert nodded, eyebrows arching. "That's quite an accomplishment. I must say, you're very unassuming." Charles chuckled softly, turning his gaze to the battered sneakers. "I suppose I just prefer comfort and sentiment over flashy things. Clothes can sometimes hide as much as they reveal." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an airline manager who had been making rounds through the cabins, greeting premium passengers. Her name tag read Valerie, and she wore a professional smile. She welcomed Robert to the flight, asking if there was anything he needed. Then she turned to Charles. "And hello, sir. I hope you're enjoying your flight with British Airways. Is there anything I can do to make your journey more comfortable?" Charles gave a small nod. "I'm fine, thank you." Valerie's gaze flickered over his attire, then back to his face. Something seemed to register in her eyes, recognition of sorts. She hesitated momentarily before speaking again. "Have we met before, Mr. Mason?" he supplied. "Charles Mason." For a split second, Valerie's composed expression faltered. She recovered quickly, but Charles had seen that flicker. It was the look of someone who recognized the name. Whether she recalled it from business news or from an in-house airline memo about influential past investors, Charles wasn't certain. Valerie smiled politely. "Well, Mr. Mason, if you need anything at all, please let me or the cabin crew know." She excused herself to continue her rounds, but the thoughtful crease on her brow hinted she might be connecting the dots. Robert looked at Charles more intently now. "Charles Mason," he repeated softly. "I feel like I've heard that name somewhere." Charles merely shrugged with a gentle smile, leaving Robert to his curiosity. Because soon enough, the truth and the karmic revelations that would rock the flight staff would come to light in a way none of them expected. As the flight neared the eastern coast of Canada, the captain made an announcement that the plane would begin its gradual descent into New York in just over an hour. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and flight attendants scurried to prepare for landing. Valerie reappeared in the business class cabin, this time with a purposeful stride. She had spent part of her break searching the airline's internal database on her tablet, a tool managers used to identify VIP customers and frequent flyers. A subtle hush fell over the row when Valerie stopped at Charles's seat. "Mr. Mason," she said warmly, "I hope you've had a comfortable flight. I'd like to extend an invitation on behalf of British Airways for you to visit our arrivals lounge after landing. We'd be honored to host you." Charles raised an eyebrow. He had not expected any special treatment. "Oh, that's very kind of you, but I'm not sure I need." Valerie smiled apologetically. "We insist." She hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice so nearby passengers wouldn't overhear. "We recognize your long-standing relationship with our airline. Whether you realize it or not, your name flags in our system as a highly valued passenger. It would be our pleasure." Realization dawned on Robert, who had been quietly observing. He looked at Charles, as though seeing him for the first time. Meanwhile, a couple of other business-class passengers who overheard the invitation exchanged curious glances. Why would an elderly man in worn clothes receive such preferential treatment? Caught slightly off guard, Charles decided not to refuse. He nodded, saying, "Thank you. I'll be sure to stop by." The moment Valerie walked away, Robert couldn't help himself. "Charles," he began cautiously, "I think I might finally know who you are. Are you by any chance Charles J. Mason, the founder of Mason and Caldwell Investments?" Charles's lips curved into a modest smile. He nodded. Robert's eyes widened in awe. "That means you're—" He swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. "You're one of the most successful businessmen of our generation. I've read about you. You were a big name in the real estate boom. Even tried to help develop alternative energy projects. You donated millions to educational programs in underserved communities. Why?" His voice trailed off as he gestured vaguely at Charles's attire. He didn't know how to politely ask why a billionaire dressed so humbly. Charles took no offense. "Sometimes the simple things in life are the most meaningful," he explained softly. "I don't measure success by what I wear. And as for traveling business class, well, it's a little indulgence, but I have my reasons for coming back to the States this way." Before Robert could ask more, the seatbelt sign chimed on, indicating the final descent was approaching. The flight attendants made their rounds, instructing passengers to return to their seats and stow their carry-on items. Charles slid his satchel underneath the seat, noticing the hush that had settled over the cabin. Perhaps word was spreading that he was someone of note. In the economy section, Tanya and Lucas were also preparing for landing, unaware of the storm of realization building at the front of the aircraft, one that would soon crash upon them in the arrivals lounge. The landing at JFK was smooth, and passengers began filing out of the aircraft. Tanya and Lucas, standing near the rear exit, offered the standard farewells, forcing polite smiles despite their fatigue. They watched with mild interest as business-class passengers disembarked, but Charles was not among the first to exit. They shrugged it off, assuming the old man would take a while to gather his things. Meanwhile, Charles took his time. He waited until the aisle cleared politely, letting others pass. He exchanged a final nod with Robert, who said, "It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Mason. I hope our paths cross again." Charles smiled, responding with a warm "likewise" before stepping into the jet bridge. In the arrivals area, Valerie was waiting with another airline representative. Their presence turned heads. It wasn't every day that airline managers greeted a passenger personally at the gate. As soon as Charles appeared, Valerie stepped forward to guide him to the arrivals lounge, a VIP space reserved for first and business class travelers and special guests. Tanya and Lucas had just finished rechecking the aircraft for any leftover items when they spotted the small cluster near the arrivals lounge entrance. Curious, they inched closer. Their jaws dropped when they recognized Charles, the elderly man in worn clothes, being greeted with deference by high-ranking airline staff. "What the?" Lucas muttered under his breath. "Why are they treating him like that?" Tanya narrowed her eyes, suspecting there was something more going on. She grabbed Lucas's arm, pulling him behind a nearby pillar so they could eavesdrop on the conversation. Valerie's voice drifted over, clear and respectful. "Mr. Mason, we have a private area prepared if you would like to freshen up or have a meal. Also, a limousine is available to take you wherever you need to go in the city." Charles shook his head gently. I appreciate the offer, but a friend is picking me up. A simple welcome will do, thank you. As they walked deeper into the lounge, passengers and airline staff parted like the Red Sea, whispering as he passed. Some recognized him from business news. Others simply saw the VIP treatment. Tanya's face flushed red. She felt a mix of confusion and embarrassment. The man she had mocked for wearing threadbare clothes was apparently a VIP guest. Lucas looked equally stunned. What have we done? He whispered, recalling the cruel remarks they made. They retreated to the staff corridor, pondering their next move. A pang of shame gnawed at Tanya's conscience. She felt compelled to apologize, or at least glean the truth behind Charles Mason's identity. Summoning her courage, she convinced Lucas to accompany her to the arrivals lounge, contriving a reason to be there under the pretext of delivering some paperwork. They maneuvered past the lounge attendant, who gave them a suspicious glance, but didn't stop them when Tanya flashed her staff ID. Inside, they spotted Charles seated in a comfortable chair, a glass of water in hand. Valerie was speaking with him quietly. As if guided by fate, Valerie left for a moment, leaving Charles momentarily alone. Heart-pounding, Tanya approached him, Lucas trailing uncertainly behind. Mr. Mason, she began, in a quivering voice. We were on your flight. We just wanted to say. She struggled to form the words that would address the tidal wave of her guilt. Charles looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. He said nothing yet, waiting to see what they had come to say. Tanya could barely swallow around the lump in her throat. She realized how badly she and Lucas had judged and insulted this man, quietly though it had been. The magnitude of their mistake weighed on her like a lead blanket. Mr. Mason, she finally managed. I'm Tanya, and this is Lucas. We were the staff who checked you in at Heathrow, and she hesitated, searching for the right words. Well, we said some things that weren't kind. We thought. Her voice wavered. We just want to apologize. We didn't realize who you were. Lucas fidgeted beside her. We're sorry, he muttered, barely meeting Charles's gaze. Charles studied them quietly. He sensed their fear and embarrassment. Yet he also felt a pang of compassion. He took a slow sip of water before replying. Apology accepted, he said softly. But please remember, you don't have to know someone's status to treat them with respect. Tanya's eyes misted at the gentle reprimand in his words. We were wrong, she confessed. It was unprofessional, and it was cruel. You just didn't look, Charles cut in gently. Didn't look like someone who deserved dignity. Is that it? His tone was calm, but the question pierced them. Lucas's cheeks flamed. No, sir, that's not what we meant. We judged you by your clothes, your appearance. We thought you couldn't afford the ticket or that you were out of place. We had no right to do that. Charles nodded, setting his glass down. The lounge around them buzzed with faint chatter, but this moment felt cocooned in stillness. After a pause, Charles said, I appreciate the courage it took to come here and admit that. Moving forward, I hope you'll remember this lesson. People aren't always what they seem. Kindness is free. It costs you nothing to offer it. A wave of relief washed over Tanya. She hadn't expected Charles to be so forgiving. Thank you, she said. Truly, thank you. Lucas echoed her sentiment, relieved they hadn't been met with anger or retaliation. Just then, Valerie returned, a polite smile on her face. She glanced at the two staffers, surmising the nature of their conversation with Mr. Mason. She offered no interruption, only a small knowing nod. Charles rose slowly from his seat, retrieving his worn leather satchel. I have a friend waiting to pick me up, he said, glancing at the time on his watch. Thank you all for your hospitality. And you too? He looked at Tanya and Lucas. I wish you both the best. May we all learn from our mistakes." He walked out of the lounge with a quiet, dignified stride, the same gentle grace he had carried all along. Tanya and Lucas stood rooted, their minds buzzing with the reality that they had just encountered a man of immense wealth and influence, yet also immense humility. As Charles exited into the bustling crowd of the arrivals terminal, a new wave of passengers walked past him, many giving the same dismissive or oblivious looks he'd grown accustomed to. But he didn't mind. He understood that his worth wasn't determined by how others perceived him. And if today's events could spark a change in even a few people's hearts, that was reward enough. When Tanya returned to her shared apartment in London a few days later, having worked the return flight from New York, she couldn't shake the memory of Charles Mason. Late at night, lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, she replayed every mocking word she had exchanged with Lucas about the old man with the ragged clothes. The guilt gnawed at her because she recognized how easily she had been swayed by appearances. The next morning, during her off day, Tanya did something unusual. She opened her laptop and typed Charles J. Mason into the search engine. Within seconds, pages of articles popped up. One headline read, "Philanthropist Charles J. Mason donates $50 million to inner-city education." Another detailed the rise of his investment firm from a two-person operation to a multinational conglomerate. A third article focused on his personal background, the challenges of growing up in a segregated neighborhood, his scholarship to a prestigious university, and his early encounters with racial discrimination in the corporate world. What struck Tanya most was how every source praised Charles for his humility and generosity. There were interviews of him wearing the same battered jacket even back when he attended large galas. One journalist had described him as the quiet billionaire who seemed more interested in improving the lives of others than flaunting his fortune. Reading these stories turned Tanya's shame into a resolve to change. She realized that her job put her in contact with people from every corner of the globe, some wealthy, some not, some well-dressed, some casual. She resolved never again to judge someone by their attire or assume she knew their story based on outward appearances. In the days that followed, Tanya noticed a shift in how she interacted with passengers. She greeted each one, more sincerely refrained from rolling her eyes at requests that seemed odd, and tried to be helpful without prejudice. She even defended a passenger who was being judged by another staff member for wearing old sandals and baggy shorts. They paid for their flight, just like everyone else, she snapped at a co-worker. Show them some respect. Though she still faced the everyday stresses of airline work, delayed flights, rate customers, mechanical issues, Tanya found that approaching passengers with empathy lightened the emotional burden. She hadn't yet told Lucas the details of her research on Charles Mason, but she suspected he might be doing some self-reflection of his own. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Charles was settling into his friend's guest house in upstate New York, already arranging meetings with local non-profits. Tanya knew this from reading a short blurb online. He was continuing his philanthropic mission unperturbed by the minor drama on the flight. The knowledge that he had forgiven her still warmed her heart. She understood the lesson that a single act of courtesy or scorn can ripple far beyond a momentary encounter. Charles had taught her that all it takes is one experience to reshape how we see the world. Lucas had grown up in a modest suburb outside of London, harboring ambitions of climbing the airline's corporate ladder. He dreamed of one day managing an entire flight crew or even moving into airline administration. But his recent experience with Charles Mason left him unsettled. He had joined Tanya in mocking a passenger, only to discover that passenger was a magnanimous billionaire with more virtue in his worn sneakers than Lucas had in his entire approach to life. Returning home to his small flat, Lucas avoided his reflection in the mirror. The guilt pressed heavily on him. He tried to brush it off as a mistake anyone could make, but the memory of Charles's gentle voice telling them they should respect everyone, regardless of their outward appearance, echoed in his mind. In an attempt to clear his head, Lucas visited his favorite pub. There he confided in his closest friend Martin, who had no connection to the airline industry. Over a couple of pints, Lucas recounted the entire incident. Martin, who worked as a social worker, listened with empathy, but didn't mince his words. "Mate, you judged him based on stereotypes. That's not just an innocent mistake, that's prejudice. You need to address that, or it'll keep happening." Lucas bristled at the bluntness, but knew Martin was right. "I didn't do it on purpose," Lucas mumbled. "It's just, he looks so out of place." "That's the point," Martin replied, tapping the rim of his glass. "What's out of place to you might be perfectly normal to someone else. And even if it isn't normal, that doesn't give you the right to belittle them." The conversation lit a fire within Lucas. He realized he couldn't walk away from this lesson. If he wanted to climb the ranks in the airline, he had to become the kind of leader who treated everyone from staff to passengers with decency. That night, he returned home and researched Charles Mason just like Tanya had. What he found shocked him. Story after story painted Charles as a philanthropic giant, especially dedicated to uplifting underprivileged communities in Africa, Asia, and the inner cities of the US. Lucas felt a swirl of emotions, admiration, regret, and a surprising sense of inspiration. Here was a man who had every reason to flaunt his wealth, but chose not to. Lucas promised himself he would actively change his habits at work. He would greet each passenger with a genuine smile and keep his cynicism in check, no matter their background or clothing. In the weeks that followed, Lucas had multiple opportunities to practice his newfound resolve. He sometimes slipped into old habits of eye-rolling or whispered judgments, but each time he caught himself. He'd remember Charles's dignified calm and Martin's firm advice. With each incremental change, Lucas felt his sense of pride shift from superficial judgments to genuine compassion and professionalism. Though he hadn't spoken to Charles since that day in the arrivals lounge, Lucas felt as though the man's quiet impact would shape him for years to come. Word travels fast in the airline industry. Valerie, the airline manager who had recognized Charles Mason's name, had reported the incident in her debrief, though not in a punitive manner. She simply documented the fact that an influential former investor and philanthropic billionaire had traveled in business class, and that certain staff might have misjudged him based on appearance. The story circulated in upper management emails. Some executives were concerned about the potential for a PR disaster if Charles Mason had been treated poorly. They recognized him as the same Charles Mason who once showed interest in a significant stake in British Airways when the airline considered raising capital a few years back. While that deal had not materialized, it was still crucial to maintain good relationships. Human Resources flagged the incident not to punish Tanya or Lucas specifically, but to highlight the importance of respecting all passengers, a principle that was already part of company policy. Soon, an internal memo went out to staff. All passengers, regardless of their perceived background or attire, must be treated with the highest standard of courtesy and respect. Our airline's reputation hinges on our professionalism and inclusivity. Tanya read the memo in the staff break room, her face flushing as she realized the impetus for this reminder was likely her and Lucas's behavior. Yet instead of resentment, she felt gratitude. The airline was addressing a widespread issue. Perhaps many staff members, not just her and Lucas, needed this wake-up call. Lucas, meanwhile, was interviewed by a mid-level manager who gently probed about the details of the flight. Lucas admitted he had initially scoffed at Charles Mason's appearance, but insisted he had learned a valuable lesson. To his surprise, the manager expressed understanding rather than harsh criticism. "We've all been there," the manager said, "but we need to grow from these experiences." In a subsequent team meeting, the supervisor reminded everyone of the airline's core values, emphasizing diversity, inclusivity, and empathy. Some crew members rolled their eyes at what they saw as corporate talk, but Lucas and Tanya listened intently, taking the message to heart. They had lived the consequences firsthand. Still, a few weeks passed without any official censure or black mark on their records. Instead, there was a sense of relief that Charles Mason had not lodged a formal complaint. It was as though the airline recognized the best course was to educate rather than punish. Tanya and Lucas were quietly grateful for this approach, embracing it as a second chance. In the days that followed, both worked diligently to redeem themselves. Their warm smiles and respectful interactions with passengers did not go unnoticed. Over time, they transformed from being the staff members who once mocked an elderly man to ones who championed the notion that every traveler deserved kindness, whether they wore tailored suits or tattered sneakers. Meanwhile, in New York, Charles Mason carried on with his philanthropic endeavors. His schedule was filled with meetings, local community centers, a charter school in Brooklyn, and an after-school coding program in the Bronx. He moved quietly, often slipping in and out without fanfare. When reporters tried to corner him for interviews, he gave polite, concise responses, redirecting attention to the organizations he supported. One day, while visiting a newly established education hub, he was approached by a teacher who timidly asked for a photo together. Charles agreed, smiling gently for the camera. That photo later made its way onto social media, accompanied by a caption praising his unheralded support for children's education. The post went viral, attracting thousands of comments lauding his humility. Among those who stumbled upon the post was Tanya. On her day off, scrolling through her feed, she recognized Charles's gentle face in the teacher's selfie. The wave of remorse returned, but it was softened by gratitude. She felt a kind of awe at how consistently he carried himself with dignity and compassion. That old jacket was still there, as were the sneakers, yet in every picture, his eyes shone with warmth. Inspired, Tanya started volunteering at a local community kitchen in London. She'd do it on her days off, serving meals to those experiencing homelessness or food insecurity. The experience broadened her perspective, reminding her again that appearances rarely tell the full story. She never forgot Charles's words. People aren't always what they seem. Lucas, on the other hand, began night classes in management and leadership. His dream of moving up in the airline was still alive, but now he wanted to become a manager who fostered respect and inclusivity. His final project revolved around a case study of airline customer service, and though he kept the specifics vague, the narrative was clearly inspired by his encounter with Charles Mason. When he presented it to his professor, Lucas added a heartfelt conclusion. Leadership isn't about power or title. It's about how you treat the people under you and around you, even those who seem beneath you. Back in New York, Charles sat in a small cafe after one of his meetings. He sipped black coffee while reading a local paper. He came across a short article praising British Airways for a recent initiative supporting diversity training among staff. The piece was only a few paragraphs, but it mentioned that the airline had taken steps to reinforce a culture of respect after an incident with a high-profile passenger. Charles smiled into his coffee cup, a glimmer of satisfaction dancing in his eyes. He suspected he knew the catalyst for that initiative, and so without sending a single letter of complaint, Charles Mason had not only transformed two airline staff members, but also influenced an entire corporate conversation. For him, the measure of success was not in stock prices or seat upgrades, but in how many hearts he could touch, even if only a little. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for journeying with us through the twists and turns of Charles Mason's story, a reminder that appearances can be profoundly deceiving. In an airport teeming with hurried travelers, we witnessed cruelty, humility, and a stunning revelation that shattered preconceived notions. The elderly black man, mocked for his worn clothes, turned out to be a retired billionaire, one whose genuine wealth lay not just in money, but in heart. As karma had its way, we saw how a single act of compassion could spark an entire ripple effect, reshaping attitudes in an airline and beyond. Now, if you found value in this tale, if it stirred your emotions or sparked new perspectives, please support this channel. Like this video, share it with friends who might need a reminder about kindness, and subscribe for more stories that inspire. Let's keep the conversation going, because every view, comment, and share helps spread these lessons even farther. Thank you for watching.